Okay, folks, let's start. Welcome back. So let me quickly remind you, yesterday we went through the basic argument about the accumulation of capital and the generation of surplus value by capital and the accumulation of surplus value and the production of capital. So that's the main analytical argument in volume 1. But in the last part of volume 1, Marx then asks the question that how did the capitalist system arise? And he offers the notion of the primary accumulation of capital or the original accumulation of capital as an answer. So I don't know German, but those who know German say that it has been mistranslated as primitive accumulation. The German word should be translated as original accumulation, which means that even though Marx was really talking about the process of emergence of capitalism in a particular location, that is in Western Europe, and he was specific that he was only talking about Britain, since the capitalist system does not develop all over the world at one place, at one time, when the capitalist system expands, it displaces the pre-existing methods of production. So the original accumulation of capital or some aspect of it is a kind of continuing process, is not only referring to the historical process, but the general process by which capitalist relations of production supplant and replace pre-existing methods of production. Now, to understand the details of the original accumulation of capital, let's go back to the circuit of capital. So by now, the circuit of capital should be very familiar to us, and it is really the key organizing principle to understand capitalism. So lot of the aspects of capitalism can be understood by looking at it. So the original accumulation of capital refers to the set of conditions that need to be established for the circuit of capital to be in operation in a particular setting. So the set of conditions that will allow the circuit of capital to work its way from the beginning to the end is what we mean by the original accumulation of capital. Now, in the last part of volume 1, Marx suggests that there are at least 3 important components of the original accumulation of capital. And that we can really understand by just looking at the circuit of capital. The first component is that to begin the circuit of capital, you need an accumulation of money capital in the hands of economic agents who will be able and motivated to use it in the circuit of capital. So that is the first component of the set of processes that we will call original accumulation of capital. The second component of the process is really the most important part of original accumulation, because when an economic agent comes to the market with a sum of money, that sum of money must be able to purchase means of production and labor power as commodities on the market. So the second set of processes are the set of processes which lead to the emergence of means of production and labor power as commodities. So means of production and labor power, they have to emerge as commodities and be available in the market to be purchased for sums of money. And the third condition is that once the finished commodities have been produced, they have to be sold for a sum of money. So you need what Marx calls a home market where the finished commodities produced by capitalist production will be able to be sold so that the commodities are transformed back into monetary form to begin the circuit again. So these three processes together comprises what Marx understands as the original accumulation of capital. But let's think about these three processes a little more. So the original process by which the accumulation of money happens in the hands of a set of economic agents who are then able and motivated to lay out that sum of money as capital in the circuit of capital happens through various ways, and Marx refers here to merchant capital. This kind of merchant capital predates capitalist production processes and the capitalist system. And merchant capital goes all over the globe hunting for profits. Now here Marx offers an important insight and concept, which is the concept of profit upon alienation. So remember, in our discussion of the first part of volume 1, we have seen that within the capitalist system, profit emerges as the exploitation of workers, the unpaid labor time of workers. That way of generating profit is characteristic of the capitalist system of production. Profit upon alienation is different. Now let's go back. When Marx starts explaining the emergence of surplus value, he immediately dismisses the argument that surplus value can be generated by unequal exchange, because if we sum up all the transactions, unequal exchange cannot generate surplus value. Profit upon alienation is precisely that. Profit upon alienation is the emergence of profit by unequal exchange. So it means that what Marx is clarifying here is that the merchant capital which generates this sum of money or accumulates money to begin this process does not accumulate through the exploitation of workers in the sense in which the capitalist system will do. It is really an extraction of value by buying cheap and selling dear. So think of the British and other European merchants who came to India, brought bought silk products and went and sold them back in Europe. The money that they made, which gradually emerged as sums of money in their hand, was not the result of profit in the sense of the extraction of surplus value that will happen later. This is merely a transfer of value. So this is an important point he makes. So this is one way in which amounts of money can get accumulated, which can be the beginning point of the circuit of capital. Now, of course, this whole discussion is much more richer. Historians afterwards have looked at this process in greater detail. But here Marx is really referring to merchant capital and the generation of profit from a different principle, which is a profit upon alienation, rather than by profit through the exploitation of labor, and its gradual accumulation in the hands of merchants. And here he mentions colonialism, loot, plunder, and all of those things which lead to or facilitate the accumulation of sums of money in the hands of merchants or other economic agents who will subsequently function as representatives of capital. Okay, now the second component of original accumulation is the more important component, and Marx is clear. He says very clearly that it is really this which is the most important historical process and conceptually the most important process which will create the conditions for the emergence of capitalism. So here what we are referring to is the emergence of means of production and labor power as commodities. So here the process that Marx has in mind starts with looking at peasants who are connected to their conditions of labor. So whatever is needed to convert their labor into use values which they can consume, and the most important component of the conditions of labor is land, the peasants and the land are fused together. So in feudal times, pre-capitalist times, there were various types of property relations, but all of those property relations gave access to peasant population to their conditions of labor. And the key process which breaks up this fusion of labor and means of production, or peasants and their conditions of labor, it breaks this up is the important part and is the second component of the original accumulation of capital. When this relationship is dissolved, is broken, then what emerges is peasants' labor emerges as labor power, which is the ability to do work emerges and is now become available in the market to be sold for a price. On the other hand, the conditions of labor, land, tools, implements, raw materials, all of which was accessible to the peasants because they have become separated, now become available as commodities to be bought and sold in the market, and that is the emergence of means of production. Now, this dissolving this link between labor and the conditions of labor, Marx is very clear that here there is a very important role of extra economic force. So he has a long discussion about the 300-year process of enclosure movements, which politically and through the intervention of state and political power gradually dissolved this relationship between peasants and land. And that facilitated the emergence of labor power and means of production as commodities. So that ensures that the second stage of the circuit of capital can be completed. So when economic agents with sums of money come to the market, they will find available the two types of commodities that they need to purchase to have the circuit of capital in place. And the third stage of the circuit of capital is the emergence of the home market. Now, the emergence of the home market is partly the result of this process, because earlier, whatever consumption goods peasants needed, they could more or less produce. Once they do not have access to their conditions of labor, whatever they need will have to be purchased on the market. And therefore, food commodities will become commodities which will be produced by some capitalist enterprise, and that will find a market in the demand that arises from the incomes that labor power earns. On the other hand, going hand in hand with this is the destruction of handicrafts. So handicrafts was kind of part of the feudal economy, and agriculture and handicrafts was closely linked together. So the destruction or the forcible separation of peasants from their land goes hand in hand with the destruction of handicrafts. Now, the destruction of handicrafts opens up the market which was earlier supplied by the products of handicrafts to be now supplanted by the products of capitalist industry. So these three processes together, so this is the M, this is the MC, which requires the MP and labor power, and this is the C prime M prime. These three together give us the three conditions which together comprise the primary accumulation of capital. So as I said, Marx was really referring to England when he was giving examples of each of these processes, but the conceptual apparatus of the original accumulation of capital can be used in other places, other locations, as long as we can see these processes or the logic of these processes in operation. So in contemporary times, the notion of original accumulation has been used, and what David Harvey calls the accumulation by dispossession is really it is just original accumulation of capital with using a different term. But when we are looking at the original accumulation in the current period, what is really going to be important is phase 2 or the second, because the accumulation of money in the hands of some economic agents who can function as capitalists has already happened in a substantial way. So really today, when the original accumulation will happen as capitalism expands, it is really this which will become important, and that is exactly what we see all over the third world. There is a process which is trying to forcibly separate this, and there is a strong resistance, so a lot of political movements around that. And along with that, destruction of handicrafts through various kinds of trade policy and other things, which opens up the ability of the capitalist system to generate demand and supplant the products produced by other forms of production. So this does have a lot of contemporary relevance because we see that happening a lot. So that is the basic idea of original accumulation. So with that, we will move on to volume 2. But we can pause and have some discussion. I think there are a lot of historical questions here which I'm not even talking about. Yes.
I actually have a couple of questions. One is the existence of free wage labor a necessary condition for capitalism? So for instance, can we think of the plantation as a capitalist enterprise where labor is not, it's not slave labor but bonded or in some sense unfree? Can we call that capitalism? A. And B, so some historians will insist on not, instead of saying merchant capital, they will insist on saying merchant wealth. Is that a distinction that is worth making? And the last thing, so you mentioned briefly that there is the different kinds of property relations under capitalism. It's not one kind of property relation. So sort of in historical debates, there's a lot of kind of hesitation to use the term feudal. Because the property relation, like for instance in India, one argument has been you can't call what pre-capitalist forms of society and pre-capitalist forms of economy in India cannot properly be called feudal because the property relations here are different than what they were in the classical European feudal case. But if, as you're saying, that there is a diversity of property relations in feudal social formations, is that hesitation to use the term then unwarranted?
Well, I mean, I'm not getting into that debate. What I wanted to just highlight is that there can be various ways in which peasants can have access to their conditions of labor. So it can be direct ownership of the land. It can be ownership of the land by the feudal lord, but access through some customary rights. So that is the sense in which there is a diversity of ways. The important thing conceptually is that the peasants do have access to the conditions of labor, and that access needs to be broken if capitalist relations have to emerge. So that's the important point. Now, again, what seems to emerge from that is that labor power becomes available as a commodity to be bought and sold in the market. That is an important part of the move from commodity production to capitalist production. So if labor power is not available as a commodity to be bought and sold in the market, then it really complicates the picture. Now in concrete analysis, there will always be cases which cannot fit directly here. So I think I will just leave it. It will be a question which needs to be investigated in its concrete details. Is it really a commodity which is being sold, or is it not? I mean, that I think is the important question. But yes, there are a whole lot of debates which we probably do not get into here. And you had third question?
The use of the term merchant capital.
Oh, merchant capital.
Because you said extraction of value through.
No, I will not use the word value. So merchant capital, Marx does use the term merchant capital. We will come to that in volume 2 in the context of capitalism. But here what we are saying is a form of capital which predates the capitalist relations of production. Now, in a sense, it is not functioning as capital yet because there is not yet a process of extraction of surplus value. So as long as we are clear that that is what we mean, it doesn't matter what we call it. Merchant capital or wealth is okay. But
value is not.
No, value is still not something that we are going to be using. No, let me correct myself. If the products are produced mainly for exchange, then they are commodities. So the silk product that the European merchants bought were mainly produced for exchange. So those are commodities. And therefore, the merchant does get a transfer of value. But that transfer of value which emerges as the profit of the merchant. So the merchants, if we look at the merchant's process will be something like this. He starts out with a sum of money and ends up with more. And what he does is goes and buys a commodity and then comes and sells it in the market for a larger sum of money. So what is happening is that there is a transfer of value from the site of production to and is realized as the profit of the merchant. The important thing is that this circuit does not hinge on a circuit like this. In capitalism, merchants also will be looking like this, and interest-bearing capital will look like this. But what will be important is that the source of that surplus value will be preying on the surplus value generated on this. So underlying the merchant capital and other forms of capital in capitalism, everything will hinge on this. Here, there is no pre-existing circuit of capital. So what is happening is on one side there are petty producers who are selling their commodities. The merchant is buying it at a sum of money M and then selling it at a sum of money M prime. So now if we think a little bit about the merchant's profit, so there is an interesting point here. So as I said, the important thing is that the profit that emerges is a profit upon alienation. So on the one hand, let's say you have silk producers in India, and you have the merchants, European merchants. So the silk producers produce the silk, merchants buy them, and then they go and sell it in Europe. So the profit that emerges precisely because the value at which it is sold is higher than the value of the commodity. And now there can be two sources of the increase in the value. It can be that merchants are buying the products from the producers at a price which is less than its value, and then selling it in Europe at that same price. in which case the total surplus that emerges as merchant's profit emerges because the merchants have bought the commodity at a cheap price from the silk producers. On the other hand, it might be that the merchants are not cheating these guys and buying the silk at its value and then coming and selling it in Europe at a price which is above its value. Both ways of generation of this surplus in the form of merchant profit can happen. Now, there is no reason to believe why only one or the other will happen. So, Kalyan Sanyal has a very nice discussion of this in his book. But then he points out, he makes the case that the surplus value that we are talking about is generated only here. But that is not necessary. The merchants might be buying the products from the silk producers at a price which is less than the value, and then selling it in Europe at a price which is much higher than the value. Now, historically, if we look at the conditions in which European merchants operated in India, we would believe that they had a lot of market power, which would have allowed them to buy the products at prices which were much lower than their value. So, the point is that this surplus which emerges as merchant profit, which gets accumulated as merchant capital, which will initiate the circuit of capital, comes about through unequal exchange. And there can be two sides of unequal exchange. There is no necessity why we should say it is only here or here. But the important thing is that this surplus is generated from a drastically different principle. That principle is that here this surplus is not representing the exploitation of any worker. It might represent the transfer of value by unequal exchange when certain economic agents buy a commodity at a price lower than its value and sell it at a price higher than its value. So that is the conceptual important point here. The empirical details, of course, will need to be worked out when we look at cases. Yes?
Simply put, no value is created in merchant capital. There is no value added to merchant capital.
Right, it's just a transfer. Right.
Regarding the whole debate on
Mm-hmm.
it's not directly connected to what we are discussing here, but the larger debates around it. This has been something which has been for some time in the Indian academy been debated for a long time. So I just want to know as to when David Harvey talks about accumulation by disposition or things like that, does he also take into account the specificity of the transition debate? I mean, is there the logic of transition that we are moving from feudalism to capitalism in David Harvey, or is David Harvey's theorization only about a phase in capitalism? Because for a long time, this debate in India has been that this is a debate, the whole debate about original accumulation has been a debate about transition, that we are moving from feudalism to capitalism. Whereas in Harvey, that debate gets marginalized. It's a specific mode of accumulation within capitalism. There is no larger debate about transition.
Right.
Secondly, I want to know, for a very long time I have been trying to read Moshe Postone. I have not been able to understand him. And you have been an intervener into that debate of Sanyal and Postone. So what is that debate? I want to know. Last year you presented a paper also here in Delhi, but I was not able to fully, get the hold of it, what you said and what you presented. I want to know in, some detail as to what was it. I have not been able to grasp the debate between Murthy and Venan Murthy was also an intervener into that debate. Not been able to. So I want to know.
Okay, the first point, yes, I mean Harvey is primarily writing about the neoliberal phase of capitalism, and he is trying to say that in the neoliberal phase, in advanced capitalist countries, we are seeing a form of accumulation which is different from the circuit of capital. And he gave it a new name. It is really what he's saying is that there are processes where accumulation is taking place by something like this. Emergence of commodities, emergence of use values as commodities which were earlier not commodities. So produced by the state, now the state is replaced by private capital. So yeah, he is not going into the debate. But you do mention, so since you mentioned the transition debate, there are a lot of interesting issues that emerge if you look at original accumulation from the perspective of the transition debate. So remember, one of the most important points, or the two broad lines of debate, is kind of the Sweezy, which is the importance of market relations and merchants, and then Dobb, which was later kind of theorized better by Brenner. Now, if you look at the original accumulation process as composed of all three, it seems that one can accommodate both positions within a broader understanding. So let's take Brenner's point. Brenner's main point is that capitalism emerged in agrarian situations. Now, if you let's say he's correct, and he does provide a lot of evidence for that. But then how do you explain the emergence of non-agrarian capitalist relations in non-agrarian settings? So you would have to somehow explain how the original accumulation is happening in the first place. Now, Brenner would say that a lot of this original accumulation is happening within agriculture because there is technological change. But then how does that transfer into non-agrarian settings? So I think the role of merchants is important, even though it is historically probably correct that capitalist relations first emerged in agrarian settings. So the two, I don't think, are so incompatible as is made out to be. I think both processes are important historically. And if you completely ignore the process of the market and the merchant, then the role of colonialism, plunder, all of that kind of is thrown out of the debate. So I think both can be accommodated. Now, Postone and Sanyal. So Postone's understanding is that everything is capital. I mean, once capital has emerged in Western Europe, from that point, he understands everything to be subsumed under capital. Sanyal makes the point that there are processes outside capital. And I think Sanyal is correct. I don't think you can make the point that everything is capital, unless you say, I mean, which becomes quite absurd. But, then Sanyal tries to explain what is this non-capital and how it, so there I think there are problems. But his main point that there is relations of production which are not capitalist, which he calls non-capital, I think is empirically valid. So there is no reason why we should take this extreme position that everything is capital just because capitalism has emerged. But then explaining the details of what is this non-capital, how it is organized, how it interacts with capitalist relations of production, whether the overall society's dynamic is predominantly determined by the logic of capital accumulation, and this is functioning subsidiarily, all those things need to be analyzed in a concrete analysis. So abstractly, I don't think we can say anything more than that.
Would it be right to say that when we're saying that in the current phase, we are basically interested, it's the second condition that becomes very important. But can we say that in current European context, it's basically that emergence of means of production as a commodity more important than the emergence of labor power as a commodity, because probably that
is already right, because in a labor surplus context, you already have labor power available. But the point is that, see, some of that labor power might be involved in relations of production which are non-capitalist. So you can, of course, extend the reserve army to say that's the latent reserve army, and now they're available. So yes, but yeah, it is probably true. Most of the struggles now is over means of production. But yes, both of those are part of the second component of the original accumulation.
Just to what Vanessa was saying, a little, taking it a little ahead, like for example, there are plantation economies
Oh.
where they're completely linked to the international, to the global market. It is tea or coffee or whatever, spices. But the conditions and relations that persist within the plantation sector in those sort of geographical areas resembles non-capitalist relations. Okay, so how are, and that's not just plantations, but plantations very majorly. How does one characterize relationships like that, which at one level would seem very, very entrenched in capitalist relations of production, but at the ground level seem not really, so that, for example, there's no way that workers can do anything but work on those plantations, in terms of whether it's geographical areas which are very, very far away, etc., etc. So how does one characterize the relations like those?
Yeah, I mean that. So this is a very old debate about how to characterize economy. Now, there are kind of extreme positions on both sides. One will say that it is capitalist because it is linked to the capitalist economy. Another will say no, what is important is the relations of production on the ground. My feeling is that one way to clarify this is to ask the question, why are we interested in understanding that? I mean, that will probably provide a correct way to choose between these, because both are correct. I mean, say the slave economy in the southern US, it does have relations in the, if we just look at the relations of production, which are completely non-capitalist. But it is also true that the slave owners operate pretty much like merchants, like capitalists, and they are very tightly integrated to the world market. Now, when both these elements are true, the question of characterizing that will probably need to be addressed by thinking why are we interested? I mean, if it is a political issue, suppose we are saying we want to characterize the production relations so as to understand the main lines of fissures in that society so that we can organize a resistance to transcend that system, then that question allows us to think why. So I am very wary of these abstract debates and taking extreme positions, saying no, this is feudal, this is semi-feudal, this is capitalist. It is better to be clear about why we are interested in those questions. That throws more light into the issue.
So one question
Okay.
pertaining to merchant capital. On the one hand, we say that merchant capital is unproductive labor. On the other hand, share the surplus value in the industry. So can we evaluate whether it is exploratory or non-exploratory?
Yes, so we will come back to that question about productive and unproductive labor. But the short answer is, if merchant capital hires wage labor, so then it can be exploitative as long as the wage it pays to its worker is less than the value added by labor in general during that period of time. So even though the whole enterprise is located in a sector which is unproductive, the workers, if they are employed as wage labor, can be exploited. But we'll come to this question. Achin, yes.
Brother points out that agrarian capitalism probably emerged in the Netherlands first,
Okay.
and then came in England. But then England is different from Netherlands in the sense that England really develops a large whole market. And for all the difference of dispute, everybody agrees that the first country to have an industrial revolution is England, not anybody else, which gives strength to what Dennis said. And afterwards, your point about, he writes a book called Merchants in Revolution, which brings in the importance of merchant. But here, and this is something that perhaps you could elaborate on, he then points out the importance of the state in also generating that end of all that. So, would you like to elaborate a bit more? Because then other countries have a kind of capitalism from the top, with the state playing a very big role in changing both and relations.
Right.
Just elaborate more on the question of the state.
I think the importance of the state is is there, and I didn't touch on that. I mean, the importance of the state in facilitating the emergence of means of production and labor power as commodities is obvious, because the whole, a large portion of the enclosure movement was the use of state power and state violence. Without that, that link between peasants and their condition of labor could not be dissolved. But the state can also facilitate the emergence of merchant capital. So, I mean, all these East India companies were really promoted by their own states. So, I think the role of the state is pretty important. And as I said, I mean, all those historical details, I think, need to be understood in the concrete points. But these are the basic things that are needed for the emergence of capitalism.
As asking that regarding original accumulation or primitive accumulation, after Marx, in this trajectory, Rosa has some argument regarding capital non-capital relations. Like even David Harvey, while formulating accumulation by disposition, refers to those points. So, but as you mentioned, this aspect of non-capital, capital doesn't subsume everything, even in the later process. This element of this aspect in the works of Rosa, is it a kind of, there is any novelty from this?
Well, Rosa Luxemburg was trying to intervene in the debate on crisis. And her point was that capitalism needs this external element to deal with the realization crisis. And as capitalism expands, it undermines the very source which will support itself, and then the system will get into a crisis. So, I mean, there is a link that it is capitalist relations are gradually supplanting the pre-existing relations. So, in that sense, she has this idea, but she did not, I think, did not use this concept or this framework of original accumulation. It was more that capitalism is encroaching on non-capital and removing the non-capitalist nature of that outside. And since that was necessary to deal with the realization crisis, the source of the strength of the system is undermined by itself. So it was in that context.
Is there any reason why you avoided reference to the notion of formal subsumption of labor?
No,
Is that because you want to avoid?
No, I think that concept is useful. So it just didn't strike me that one could bring that in. But I mean, Marx's discussion of formal subsumption is within the domain of capitalist relations. So it is so when we discuss the production conditions or the changes in production under capitalist relations, remember the first stage of the organization of production Marx talked about is cooperation. And the key feature of cooperation is that the pre-existing methods of production are just taken over by capital without changing it. That is precisely what Marx later calls formal subsumption of labor by capital, where capitalist relations prevail, but the methods of production are just taken over from the previous methods and nothing is changed. So, I mean, that is a way of the development of capitalist relations. So if that I think is relevant, I think one should point that out. But I thought Sujata was referring to some relations of production which are, she was talking about not the methods but the relations. So the relations of production involve non-freedom, and the methods, the technology might be very advanced. So that brings in the complexity, whether you want to call it capitalist or not. So in that sense, it was not directly an application of the formal and real subsumption. But it's a useful concept, and I think one can make use of that. Yes?
You mentioned that there are several good historical readings on original accumulation, other than Marx himself.
Well, I was referring to the Suzy-Dobb debate, and then the Brenner debate, and the historical literature that emerged after that. So one book that is useful is Ellen Mixins Wood. So, but I have read that book, and I have one problem. I mean, her argument hinges too much on the market. So her argument is that capitalism is a system where structural constraints emerge from participation in markets. I think that is true but incomplete, because you require the emergence of labor power as a means of production. If you remove this from the picture, you don't have capitalism, and that is something that is missing from our argument. And I think other than that, that's a great book, but that argument, that point is quite weak in her whole argument.
You said that this characterization thing, whether the system is capitalist, semi-feudal or feudal, does not make sense if we do not explicate the reasons why we are characterizing. Can you please explain more why do you say that? Because then anybody who is saying that this system is capitalist will have a, all the positions will seem right. I mean, there would be no debate. I mean, one would say this is semi-feudal, and he would have a different mode of, thinking about the question of agency. Other would say this is a capitalist system, and he would have a different mode of thinking about agency. So where is the scope for debate then? Like, there has been a constant debate for the last 40-50 years in the Indian academia. The debate has been around this only, whether the system is this or that or whatever. The recent debate by Chatterjee and Shibbar is basically the debate boils down to that.
Right, but you see, there are political motivations for the debate. If we go back to the earlier debate between communist streams, the motivation was organizational and strategic. So, I mean, that might be reflected in academic debates, but that motivation needs to be foregrounded. And it is that which gives meaning to all these debates. Why should we be interested in whether it's capitalist or non-capitalist? I mean, because it has a lot of political implications, how you'll organize. So that is what I meant. I mean, that once you are clear about why you are interested in the question, that will probably allow you to think carefully. So if in this context, then we think of, let's say, the plantation. Now, if you want to organize workers there, it then becomes relevant whether they have the freedom to form a union or not. So then it becomes important to understand their unfreedom, not as an abstract question of whether it's capitalist or not. So that's what I meant. But this is a very big debate. Let's not get into this. See. Okay, so let's now move into volume 2. We can just transition. Is there any need for a break? 11:30. Okay. So let me just set up the object of analysis in volume 2, and then we can take a break. So couple of introductory points. So we know that Marx had worked out the basic logic contained in all the 3 volumes before he actually had the opportunity to come and pull out the material for volume 1. And after he finished volume 1, he put lot of effort to revising it, and it got translated, and he was completely involved in that and never got the time to come back and do the work necessary to produce volume 2 and 3. So it was Engels who went through the notebooks, and it took him an enormous amount of effort to make sense firstly of what was written, because Marx's writing was very difficult. 2-3 people could read what he had written. So his wife could read it, and Engels could read it, and later his daughters could read. You know, only once during his lifetime, Marx had applied for a job as a railway clerk, and he did not get the job because his writing was so bad, nobody could read what he had written. So it was notoriously difficult. So that means that there is some element of incompleteness to the arguments in volume 2 and 3. Now that probably makes it more difficult to read, and that is probably one reason why most people don't venture into volume 2 and 3. So I would certainly encourage you to read volume 2 and 3, but with the help of somebody who has already read it. So somebody like Duncan Foley's book, he gives a good overview of the whole argument, and then you can get into the details. Because the text, since it was not completed, it is sometimes it just breaks off, the arguments have not been completed, sometimes he goes off on a tangent into some other argument and then returns 30 pages later with the original argument. So if you don't have an overall picture of what's the whole thing about, it is very difficult, it is easy to get lost and frustrated. Moreover, the way volume 1 is written is very engaging, and it is very passionate and powerful. Volume 2 and 3, because the issues are little more technical, at many points it becomes very dry reading. So it takes effort to kind of keep going, and then the thing breaks off, so all of which make it difficult to read. And that's why, I mean, having an idea of the overall argument and where they are located in the various volumes is useful to then start reading it. Okay, now what is the object of investigation in volume 2? So remember, volume 1 and volume 2 are both pitched at the level of capital in general. So we are still not going to introduce the competition between capitalists and credit. Those will come in volume 3. Volume 2 is coming back to a question which Marx abstracted from when he looked at volume 1. In volume 1, the circuit of capital assumed that commodities could be sold at prices necessary to realize all the value. So Marx is very clear that this is a problem that needs investigation. It is not an obvious issue, but in volume 1 I am going to abstract from this, and I am going to come back to this in volume 2. So the main question that is investigated in volume 2 relates to the question of realization of surplus value. The surplus value that is generated and embedded in commodities, how it gets realized through sale. Now, the domain of the economy where commodities are bought and sold is what Marx calls the sphere of circulation, and distinguishes it from the sphere where the production process takes place, and that he calls the sphere of production. So the process of realization will take place in the sphere of circulation. So the first 2 parts of volume 2 is an analysis of the general process of circulation of capital. So volume 2 has 3 parts. So 1, 2 is a general analysis of the circulation of capital, because this is the sphere in which commodities are bought and sold, and that is necessary to understand the realization of surplus value. So part 3 of volume 2 is about the realization of surplus value. But to do this, we need to first get an overall picture and overall idea of the process of circulation of capital. And that is what is analyzed in parts 1 and 2 of volume 2. Once we have the apparatus in place, it allows us to answer some of the questions related to realization, but it also gives us some nice picture about the overall capitalist economy, how it grows, flows and stocks, and lots of other things emerge. So we will start with a general analysis of circulation of capital and then come to the realization of surplus value. Okay, so let me start. So the circulation of capital is organized around the circuit of capital. Now, the circuit of capital is really the most useful conceptual apparatus. So this is the circuit of capital. Now here Marx brings in some concepts. So what he calls this is the circuit of industrial capital. Now industrial capital does not refer to production of what we, or does not refer to the distinction between industry and services that we make today. The circuit of industrial capital refers to any capitalist commodity production which can be represented abstractly like this. So that output of that capitalist enterprise can be a good or it can be a service. So when we say industrial capital, it is not related to the way we use that word today. It just means capitalist commodity production. So this is the circuit of capital. Now, if we look at the various phases of this circuit, we can see that the circuit of capital can be broken up into 3 stages. So this is stage 1, this is stage 2, and this is stage 3. So in stage 1, what is happening? The capitalist is coming to the market with a sum of money as a buyer of commodities and using that sum of money to buy 2 types of commodities, means of production and labor power. So stage 1 is happening in the sphere of circulation. So the sphere of circulation is the sphere where commodities are bought and sold. In stage 2, the commodities that have been bought are brought together in the production process. So stage 2 no longer happens in the sphere of circulation, it happens in the sphere of production. Once the commodities have been produced, the capitalist returns to the market with the basket of commodities, but now as a seller. So again, the last stage of the circuit of capital entails buying and selling of commodities, and therefore stage 3 happens in the sphere of circulation. So the circuit of capital, which represents the abstract movement of value as it goes through the process of production and realization of the surplus value, entails 3 different stages. Each stage takes place in a different sphere and are happening consecutively. Stage 1 in sphere of circulation, stage 2 in the sphere of production, and stage 3 in the sphere of circulation. So with this distinction, it is important to think a little more about the distinction between production and circulation, because that will be key to some of our discussions about productive and unproductive labor. So within the sphere of circulation, what happens is value is produced. In the sphere of production, value is created. In the sphere of circulation, what happens is the value that has already been created changes its form. So, one way to distinguish between the sphere of circulation and the sphere of production is the sphere of production is where the content of value changes, and the sphere of circulation is where the form of value changes. So, if you think of this abstract representation, what is going on is you have value in the form of commodities, finished products, let's say 1000 cars which have been produced, and what will happen is they will be sold, and what is essentially happening is value is changing its form from commodities to money, and this is precisely what defines what Marx means by the sphere of circulation. It is an economic sphere where the form of value changes. It is important because a change in the form of value cannot change the magnitude of value. That is the crucial analytical point which will allow us to separate the sphere of productive activity, by which we will mean activities which create value and which change the magnitude of value, from activities which preserve the value but do not change the value. And that will be really what we will mean by productive and unproductive. So this distinction is really analytically important. In the sphere of production, value is created, and therefore the magnitude or content of value changes. And in the sphere of circulation, all that happens is the form of value changes. If you go back here, again what is happening is a sum of money is used to purchase a bundle of commodities. So all that is happening abstractly is that value, which was initially in the form of money, changes its form and takes the form of commodities. Tea. Okay. Good time for a tea break.